Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. We are very happy to say that we are now a family of million-plus learners. It brings us immense joy to know that we have been able to make a difference in your civil services preparation. For this, we would like to thank each one of you for supporting us in this journey, and we promise to keep the joy of learning alive even during these tough times. Going forward, I would request you to continue to support us with your likes and constructive comments. So with this, let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper, beginning with an article from the front page of the Delhi edition. This article helps us understand the impact of the pandemic and the lockdown on the finances of state governments. A study conducted by the Reserve Bank of India has shown that out of the total revenue of a state government, around 47.5% of it comes from the central devolution of funds that is made as per the recommendations of the Finance Commission. And around 50% of the revenue of the state government is raised through its own taxes. Out of this tax revenue, around 90% of the taxes comes from the sale of liquor, petroleum products, stamp duty, registration of vehicles, etc. But as a result of the pandemic and the lockdown, this crucial source of revenue has seen a decline of 80 to 90%. As a result of the lockdown, there has been no sale of liquor, the demand for petroleum products has declined drastically, and there has been no new registration of property and vehicles. So as a result, tax revenue for most state governments has declined by 80 to 90% during the lockdown period. Along with this decline in revenue, the pandemic has resulted in a significant increase in expenditure for the state governments. As a result of the pandemic, states are required to spend more on testing, quarantine and treatment. They have been required to allocate more financial resources for strengthening the healthcare infrastructure in the state, and the expenditure has gone up because states have been required to provide for cash transfers for the weaker sections. They have been required to arrange for food and shelter homes for the migrant workers and the homeless people. So as a result of this increased expenditure and the sudden fall in tax revenue, the finances of most state governments are in a very precarious situation. That's the reason why state governments have been demanding the central government to speed up the payment of GST compensation, which has been pending for a few months. States have asked the centre to amend the FRBM Act and revise the fiscal deficit targets so that they can increase their borrowings in order to meet the increased demand for expenditure at a time of falling revenues. States have also been asking the Reserve Bank of India to increase the limit under its Ways and Means Advances facility. Just a few days back, we had discussed that the RBI provides a borrowing facility to both the central government and the state governments known as the Ways and Means Advances facility. Under this facility, the Reserve Bank of India allows the central government and the state governments to borrow from it when there is a temporary mismatch in their finances. The borrowing limit under the Ways and Means Advances facility was recently increased by the RBI when it announced its second monetary package in order to help the Indian economy overcome the impact of the pandemic and the lockdown. But state governments have said that this increase in borrowing limit is inadequate to meet their financial requirements, and hence they have requested the RBI to further increase the borrowing limits under the Ways and Means Advances facility. Now let's take up an article from page number 8, which deals with the Aarogya Setu app. See, the Aarogya Setu app is an initiative of the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, and it has been developed by the National Informatics Center in order to help the Government of India to carry out contact tracing of COVID-19 patients and establish perimeter control over those who have been quarantined. This application also gives out alerts to the public if they have come in contact with a COVID-19 patient by using Bluetooth technology. So considering the role that this app could play in containing the spread of the pandemic, the Prime Minister has already called upon the citizens to install the app, and the Home Ministry has already made the app mandatory in containment zones and for employees of both public sector and private sector units. And over the last few weeks, we have even discussed the privacy concerns that has been raised by the Aarogya Setu app and the lack of a legal framework which could guarantee data protection and data privacy to the citizens. But apart from the features and the benefits of the app and the privacy concerns raised by it, this article talks about the flaws in its design. These flaws have been pointed out by the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment, and it has asked the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology and the National Informatics Center to address these flaws. The Social Justice Ministry has pointed out that due to inherent flaws in the design of the application, it has become inaccessible to PWDs or persons with disabilities, especially to those with hearing and visual challenges. With regard to persons with hearing impairment, the Social Justice Ministry has pointed out that the app does not have any special features which would have allowed them to access the app, and hence the Social Justice Ministry has asked the app developers to consider providing sign language interpretation or closed captioning. Then even the visually impaired have not been able to access the app due to inherent flaws in the design of the application. Even though the application comes with a screen reader, it is faulty and hence it is not helpful to the visually impaired in navigating through the app. So the Social Justice Ministry has asked the NIC to consider providing an audio guide for navigation which could help the visually impaired to access the app. It has also asked the NIC to provide for proper color contrast in order to ensure that the app is visually impaired friendly as well. The Social Justice Ministry has pointed out that failure to address these design flaws will constitute a violation of the rights that have been guaranteed to persons with disabilities under the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act of 2016. Now let's take up an article from page number 9 that refers to the diplomatic standoff that has been caused between the United States and China as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Ever since the pandemic broke out, President Trump and his administration have openly blamed China to be responsible for causing the COVID-19 outbreak. President Trump has gone to the extent of stating that American intelligence agencies believe that novel coronavirus was let out into the open through an accidental leak which occurred at the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Apart from this, the Trump administration has blamed China for misreporting and falsifying information related to the pandemic. According to the United States, the pandemic could have been averted and the outbreak could have been limited to China itself had China been more truthful and honest in its response. So on the basis of these allegations, the Trump administration has promised to make China pay for causing immense suffering to the world, particularly to the United States. In response to these allegations, China has retaliated and criticized the Trump administration for indulging in a blame game and for unnecessarily increasing diplomatic tensions at a time when global powers should have been cooperating with each other. In response to these allegations from the United States, China has taken a series of aggressive steps of its own. As a counter to the United States, China has started taking aggressive military steps in the South China Sea. It has clamped down on the pro-democracy movement that was going on in Hong Kong for months together against China's autocratic leadership. It has even raised a diplomatic issue with the United States over the support that it has given to Taiwan at the United Nations. See, China sees Taiwan as an integral part of its territory. But Taiwan is a self-governed territory which has always sought independence from China, and this cause has been supported by the United States. In fact, the US maintains a strong diplomatic and military relationship separately with Taiwan. Recently, the United States has been expressing support and it has been campaigning for a greater role for Taiwan at the United Nations. So this is how the diplomatic fault lines between the US and China have been exposed by the pandemic. Now it is becoming increasingly clear that the United States is not going to stop, and it is going to take a series of steps in order to impose an economic cost, a diplomatic cost, and a scientific cost on China. As a part of these coercive measures, the Trump administration is looking to block a US government pension fund from investing in Chinese companies. The objective of the Trump administration behind this move is to block the flow of capital from the United States to China. Then President Trump has already announced restrictions on the usage of electrical equipment in the American grid system if these equipment have any links to foreign adversary states, which is basically an indirect reference to China. See, China is one of the major producers of electrical equipment, and they have been installed in the grid systems of most of the countries. But this dominance of Chinese electrical equipment in domestic grid systems has always been seen as a national security threat by Western governments and as well as by the Indian government. These countries have reason to believe that Chinese companies that manufacture electrical equipment are closely connected to Chinese security agencies, and this could potentially create a backdoor for a cyber attack on their electrical grid systems. So by highlighting this threat and by using the pandemic as an excuse, President Trump has already restricted the usage of Chinese electrical equipment on American grid systems. Apart from this, the Trump administration has decided to cut off American funding to Chinese virology labs, especially to the labs in Wuhan, and end collaboration between American institutions and Chinese institutions. So this diplomatic standoff between the United States and China that has been caused by the pandemic has even extended to information warfare or psychological warfare between the two. China is actively engaging in cyber in order to deflect blame and responsibility for the pandemic, and it is trying to rebuild its image that it had carefully nurtured. And on the other hand, the United States is also engaging in information warfare because it is desperately trying to retain its superpower status, which has taken a major hit as a result of its disastrous performance in containing the pandemic. So going forward, we can expect these tensions to escalate further, considering the aggressive steps that are being taken by both the countries. Now let's take up an article from page number 11. With regard to COVID-19, a number of cases of reinfection had started to emerge in China and South Korea, and this had caused a lot of concern amongst the scientific community. A few patients who had recovered from the disease, they started to test positive even after a few days or few weeks after recovering from the infection. So when such cases started to emerge in China and South Korea, it raised a concern with regard to the possibility of reinfection. These cases led experts to believe that the protection being offered by our antibodies was only for the short term, and this raised questions over the inability of our immune system to fight against COVID-19 for the long term. If the possibility of reinfection was true, then it would also raise questions over the vaccines that are currently being developed. The assumption behind the vaccines that are currently being developed is that it will provide us long-term immunity against COVID-19. But the possibility of reinfection started raising questions over the effectiveness of these vaccines. But now it has emerged that these cases in China and South Korea, which appear to be cases of reinfection, is not actually reinfection, but instead it is a case of false positive results being given out during testing. A study has shown that the reason why such false positives are occurring when recovered patients are being tested is that the molecular test or the RT-PCR test is detecting the dead fragments of the SARS coronavirus 2. Because a molecular test does not distinguish between live and dead genetic material, and as a result, the test was detecting the dead genetic material of the virus, such as RNA, epithelial cells, etc. And hence, even recovered patients were being tested positive even after a few days after their recovery. Studies have shown that this dead genetic material of the virus can remain in the body of recovered patients for up to 2 months, and a faulty molecular test can detect this dead genetic material, and this was giving out a false positive result, leading to the wrong diagnosis of the recovered patient. Now let's take up a very interesting article from page number 11, in which the writer is exploring the possibility of employing nanotechnology and using our skin and body sweat as a diagnostic tool in order to detect the presence of diseases. So basically, the writer is making a case for skin-based diagnostics. The writer recalls the early days when our family physicians used to feel our skin in order to detect any abnormalities. Today, we have wearable technology such as skin patches which can provide for targeted drug delivery. This has been made possible due to evolution in the field of nanotechnology, microelectronics, and biocompatible polymers. By using these technologies, we have already developed what is known as e-skin or electronic skin, which can provide for targeted drug delivery. The writer says that the same technology can be used to treat our sweat, that is our body sweat, as a diagnostic tool in order to detect diseases. See, sweat basically acts as a thermoregulator, and it regulates the inner temperature of our bodies. 99% of sweat is comprised of water, and the remaining 1% is made up of different types of salts such as sodium, chloride, potassium, calcium, magnesium, etc. The writer refers to studies which have shown that the concentration of salts in our sweat varies depending on our body temperature, which in turn undergoes a change if we are suffering from any diseases. The writer says that our sweat glands are regulated by few neurons, and the functioning of these neurons can be affected if we are suffering from diseases. So when a person is suffering from a disease, changes will occur in the functioning of our neurons and in the functioning of our sweat glands, and this in turn causes a change in the concentration of salts present in our body sweat. The writer says that this change in the concentration level of salts in our sweat can be detected through sweat analysis by making use of electronic skin. So in short, if e-skin is applied to carry out sweat analysis, then it can become a diagnostic tool to detect the presence of diseases. For example, the writer says that in a person suffering from cystic fibrosis, the ratio of sodium to chloride ions in the sweat is different from that of a normal person. Similarly, in the case of a person suffering from diabetes, there is a higher concentration of glucose found in the sweat. So by detecting these changes through sweat analysis, the writer says we can diagnose diseases in a more efficient manner. The writer refers to a few studies to show that specific sensory probes can be developed to detect the presence of specific salts. So if these salt-specific sensory probes are attached to the e-skin, then it can provide for accurate sweat analysis, which can become an effective diagnostic tool. Then the data collected by these sensory probes can be transferred via Bluetooth technology to phones and other digital devices. The writer says that the advances that we have already made in the field of nanotechnology and microelectronics can make this possible. Currently, such electronic skin patches are powered by micro batteries. The writer says that in the future, these e-skin patches can be powered by our sweat itself, because the composition of our sweat is such that it can be easily engineered to become a power source for such e-skin patches. And the column also points out that human sweat is not known to carry any pathogen such as virus or bacteria, because the sweat has a germ-killing protein known as Dermcidin. Kindly note this down, this can be very important for prelims. Next, we have a column on page number 11 which refers to the vaccine development efforts against COVID-19. But we have already covered this topic in detail on the 13th of March, so I request you to kindly go back and watch this analysis, and maybe you can go through this column once. Next, we have an article on page number 14 which refers to the Sherdukpen community. This is an ethnic group found in the West Kameng district of Arunachal Pradesh, and they follow Buddhism. Primarily, members of the Sherdukpen community are agriculturalists, but traditionally they have also practiced hunting and fishing. But the most unique practice that the community is known for is for its traditional indigenous technique of honey hunting. This traditional indigenous honey hunting technique has been captured in a documentary known as Chi Lupo or Honey Hunter, which recently won the Best Documentary Award at the Dada Saheb Phalke International Film Festival Awards. This award-winning documentary illustrates how the traditional indigenous honey hunting technique of the Sherdukpen community is being lost due to modernization. Now let's take up the practice questions. Which of the following statements are correct? The Unicode Consortium is a non-profit organization which specifies the representation of text in software products. The Unicode standard assigns code to characters from different languages in the world so that they can be understood and displayed across software platforms. It is owned by Wikipedia. Amongst the given statements, the third statement is incorrect. So the correct answer is option B, 1 and 2 only. This question has been asked because we have an article on page number 5 that makes a reference to Unicode Consortium. See, every language and its script is made up of a set of characters, or what we call as alphabets. And if these characters have to be displayed on software products such as operating systems, search engines, the World Wide Web, etc., then each character in the language or in the script has to be encoded. And if the usage and display of these characters has to be made universal, then the encoding has to be standardized. There has to be a uniform method through which these characters are encoded. And to make this happen, we have a non-profit organization based out of the United States known as Unicode Consortium. This organization basically lays down a uniform standard for encoding the characters of languages that are spoken and used around the world. It is this standardization which makes it possible to display different languages on various software products. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the following statements are correct? The National Investigation Agency or NIA is an intelligence agency dedicated for counterterrorism. It is empowered to deal with terror-related crimes across states without special permission from the states. Special NIA courts have been notified by the Government of India for trial of cases registered under the NIA Act of 2008. Amongst the given statements, the first statement is incorrect. So the correct answer is option D, 2 and 3 only. See, the National Investigation Agency is India's premier counter-terrorism law enforcement agency, not an intelligence agency. Now you might ask, what's the difference between an intelligence agency and a law enforcement agency? I want you to take this up as an exercise and read about the difference between an intelligence agency and a law enforcement agency. This organization was established in 2008 as an immediate response to the 26/11 attacks by passing the NIA Act through the Parliament. Its jurisdiction extends to all terrorism-related cases across the country, and it can operate across all states without obtaining any special permission from the states. And under the Act, special NIA courts can be set up in order to fast-track the hearing of terror-related cases. This question has been asked because we have an article on page number 5 which makes a reference to the National Investigation Agency. Now let's take up the next practice question. Methyl isocyanate is infamously associated with Minamata disaster, usage of chemical weapons during the Vietnam War, Bhopal gas tragedy, Deepwater Horizon oil spill in Gulf of Mexico. The correct answer is option C. It is associated with the Bhopal gas tragedy. See, the Bhopal gas tragedy, which occurred in 1984, is said to be the worst industrial disaster of the world. During this disaster, from the factories of Union Carbide, a toxic gas known as methyl isocyanate accidentally leaked out into the city of Bhopal, resulting in the death of thousands of people. And this disaster continues to have a long-term health impact even to this day. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 7, all the survivors of the Bhopal gas tragedy would be separately screened in order to identify their vulnerability to COVID-19. Because as we already know, the fatality rate of COVID-19 happens to be very high amongst people who are suffering from comorbid conditions. Now let's take up the next practice question. The Alawites, an ethno-religious group, are primarily centered in Syria. Option C is the right answer. This question has been asked because we have an article on page number 9 which refers to a dispute in the family of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. This article provides us an opportunity to understand the unique demographics of Syria and how it has played a role in causing a civil war in the country. See, in Syria, a majority of the population are Sunni Muslims. According to estimates, around 60 to 70% of Syrian population are Sunni Muslims. Whereas Alawites are an ethno-religious group or a sect belonging to Shia Islam, and they constitute a minority in Syria. According to estimates, hardly around 11 to 12% of Syrian population are Alawites. But despite belonging to a minority community, the family of Bashar al-Assad, who happen to be Alawites, have ruled Syria for 50 years, and this dictatorship of the Assad family is said to be one of the root causes behind the civil war in the country. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the following statements are correct? LIBOR is an interest rate average calculated from estimates submitted by the leading banks in London. It acts as a primary benchmark for short-term interest rates around the world. LIBOR is calculated by the Intercontinental Exchange and is not regulated by the British government. Amongst the given statements, the third statement is incorrect, so option B is the right answer. See, LIBOR stands for London Interbank Offered Rate. It is basically the average interest rate that is offered by banks in London while giving out short-term loans to other banks. So this average interest rate has become a global benchmark for short-term loans, and it is calculated by the Intercontinental Exchange and published by Thomson Reuters regularly. But the third statement is incorrect because LIBOR is regulated by various acts of the British Parliament in order to prevent fraud or criminal conspiracy while the interest rate is being fixed. This question has been asked because we have an article on page number 10 which makes a reference to LIBOR. Now let's take up the next practice question. Which of the following statements are correct? RBI issues licenses to cooperative banks for carrying out banking business under the Banking Regulation Act of 1949. RBI regulates the banking functions of cooperative banks under the provisions of the Banking Regulation Act and the Reserve Bank of India Act 1934. Both the statements are correct. Option C is the right answer. This question has been asked because according to this article on page number 10, the Reserve Bank of India has cancelled the banking license which had been given to a cooperative bank based out of Mumbai. The reason why the banking license has been revoked is because the cooperative bank was no longer in a position to honor the commitments that it had made to its depositors. So considering the weak financial position of the bank, RBI has decided to revoke the banking license, and the depositors who are going to lose their money, they will be provided a maximum of 5 lakh rupees through the Deposit Insurance and Credit Guarantee Corporation as prescribed by existing laws. So this article helps us understand that RBI grants licenses and it can revoke licenses of cooperative banks as per the provisions of the Banking Regulation Act, and it can regulate the functioning of these banks through the provisions of both the Banking Regulation Act and as well as the RBI Act. Now let's take up a practice question from the 2019 prelims paper. Consider the following statements. Asiatic lion is naturally found in India only. Double-humped camel is naturally found in India only. One-horned rhinoceros is naturally found in India only. Amongst the given statements, only the first statement is correct. Because see, in India, the camel we find is the single-humped camel. It is similar to the camel found in West Asia. But double-humped camels are found in Central Asia, parts of China and parts of Mongolia. So the second statement is incorrect. And the one-horned rhinoceros or the Indian rhinoceros is found in India and as well as in Nepal. So this makes the third statement incorrect. Whereas the Asiatic lion, which has been listed as endangered by IUCN, can be naturally found only in India in the Gir National Park of Gujarat. So the correct answer is option A, one only. Finally, let's take up a couple of mains practice questions. The first question, the COVID-19 pandemic has escalated diplomatic tensions between United States and China. Discuss. The second question, examine the design limitations of the Aarogya Setu app and the privacy concerns raised by it. So kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the comment section below. So this concludes our discussion for the day. Thanks for watching.